Today's session will be Occupation 101, the Settlement Enterprise. I'm Madeline Cheragino, Senior Congressional Liaison for J Street. I run our Congressional Education Program, which includes our delegations to the region. And I'm excited today to welcome Yehuda Shaul, who I have had the pleasure of working with over the years. Yehuda is the co-director and founder of Breaking the Silence, a nonprofit organization of veteran IDF combatants. After serving as a commander during the Second Intifada, Yehuda organized with his fellow former soldiers who had served in the occupied territories to present their testimonies to the Israeli public. Yehuda's ability to accurately and compellingly explain the human cost of the occupation on both the occupied and the occupiers has made him a much sought expert for lawmakers and diplomats around the world. If at any time during the presentation you have a question, please type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Now, welcome, Yehuda.
Thank you very, very much. It's really an honor and a privilege to do this session number 1 out of 2. So maybe I'll say a few words about myself very, very quick, and a little bit about what we're going to do this evening, and then we'll get to the spiel, and hopefully we can have a good conversation at the Q&A part. My name is Yehuda Shaul. I'm 37 years old, Jerusalemite. I basically grew up in what you would call the political right in Israel, did my high school in a settlement in the West Bank, graduate high school, joined the IDF, served from March 2001 to March 2004 as an infantry combat soldier and a commander, more or less the peak of the violence of the Second Intifada, which I spent about 2 years in the West Bank, more than a year in the city of Hebron. And basically what I've done, what I've seen, what I witnessed throughout my service brought me to get involved in Breaking the Silence. And since I'm out of the army in 2004, March 2004, this is basically what I'm doing. This evening, instead of going through my personal experience or personal experiences of individual soldiers on the ground, what we're going to do is kind of like the work of Breaking the Silence can basically be divided to 2. The heart of our work is collecting soldiers' testimonies. Men, women who served speak out about their experience, and cross-checking, verifying these testimonies and publishing them. And the second thing is doing a lot of educational and advocacy. Lectures, panel discussions, briefings, and visits to the field. And one of the tours that we do in the West Bank, around Bethlehem or around Ramallah, is what we call an introduction to the occupation, which is an attempt to kind of like zoom out and look at the big picture. Not the individual experience of a soldier, not even the analysis of all the testimonies we have from over 1,200 soldiers by now, but actually look at the strategy from the Israeli administration perspective, from 67 to today, and kind of like see where our personal experience as soldiers on the ground fits in the big picture. So of course we cannot go now for a 7-hour tour in the field. We have limited time today. So what we're going to try to do is take one part of that tour, which is just looking at the settlement enterprise today and trying to come to conclusions from the perspective of the Israeli authorities from 67 to today. So this is not about, in a way, most of the day is just about evidence, laying down evidence, tracking the development of Israeli policy in terms of the big strategy, how to settle and why, and what we were trying to achieve. Next session, which is next week, we're going to do is try to look at the issues of access and movement of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank from 1967 to today, and try to put together what we would see today about the strategy and ideas behind the settlement enterprise, plus strategies and ideas behind issues of restrictions and movement of Palestinians, and try to come to political conclusions about Israeli politics and try to understand a bit better the reality where we are today politically in Israel, where we are on the verge of moving from occupation to annexation. So this is not out of nowhere. We're just going to try to see at the development and try to understand why and how we've arrived where we are today. So I'll maybe just start with today, if I may. Talking about the settlement enterprise, why, how, and what was behind the reality or the facts on the ground, as we call usually when it comes to settlements. So I'll start from 1967. Yeah, some of these stuff are pretty basic, but just to so we can all keep the same speed here and go through what is, I would say, the minimum necessary to understand this big picture. In the Six-Day War, Israel more than tripled its land, conquering the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, West Bank, Gaza. And by the way, many of the things we're going to talk today about, these strategic ideas actually apply also to Gaza. Some of them might even to the Golan Heights, some of them even to Sinai, but we are focusing on the West Bank mainly today, so we're kind of like zooming in. So we more than tripled the land of Israel in 1967 after the war, and then the question is, what the hell are you going to do with all this land? And in a way, Israel in that moment faced the question Israel is facing until today, which is geography versus demography. On one hand, you want the land. At the other end, there is people. Yeah, there is Palestinians living there, and you don't want the people. So what do you do? Yeah, because actually, it's the question of whether if you annex and there is a population, do you give them rights or not, and what it means to the character of the regime. So let's look at the demography in 1967. And it's important for me to say that I'm going to look a lot about geography and demography today. This is not because for me, demography is an issue and being non-Jewish, you're illegitimate, etc. This is just because this is the Israeli system and how it's established and thinks about the reality, and that's why it's important to keep these things in mind. So in 1967, we have more or less 2.65 million citizens of Israel. About 11.5% of them are Palestinian citizens of Israel, while in the West Bank and Gaza, we have almost 1 million Palestinians. So that basically gives us a breakdown of 65% Jews, 35% Palestinians, river to the sea. And again, the question is, what do you do with it? If you really look to the minutes of the government, of the cabinet back then, protocols, it's very clear that there is no real plan. Yeah. Actually, the common belief was the international community is going to knock on our doors and make us retreat, leave these territories, just like what happened after 1956 when we conquered Gaza in Sinai, where in 1957 we had to give it back. But the international community didn't come, so we are still there. And then the question comes, what do you do with there? There is basically two ministers who have a vision, who start to implement it, and ultimately that kind of like a mishmash of these two visions will become the Israeli policy. One of them was Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense. His idea was very simple. We basically want the entire land to control, river to the sea. We open borders, we integrate economy, freedom of movement. Palestinians can move around, can work in Israel, etc. And because we don't want to swallow the demography, what we're going to give Palestinians is some level of self-management, not over territory, only over population. While another minister, Alon, deputy prime minister at the time, had a different idea, which was, let's divide the territory. Some parts of the territory that we believe are strategic for us and don't have much population, Palestinian population, we will take to Israel. And other parts where the massive population centers are, and we'll see it soon, will become a future Palestinian autonomy. But again, the eastern border of Israel will be the Jordan River. The question is how we don't swallow the demography. There is one exception to all that, and that is East Jerusalem. So we can see the green line. yeah, the armistice lines of 49. And basically we can see in red the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem extended basically into the West Bank, and what was East Jerusalem under Jordanian rule plus a lot of more territory, yeah, is basically annexed to Israel and becomes East Jerusalem. Palestinians there are not in the same status as the rest of the West Bank. They are residents of Israel. They don't have a right to vote to parliament. That residency can always be revoked under few conditions, several conditions, but we don't have the time to go too much into detail. That's a price we pay for actually zooming out and trying to cover 53 years and a half an hour. But right away, Israelis move into the Jewish quarter in the old city in Jerusalem. Yigal Allon even gets a house there. In those kind of settlements, yeah, because of the historical significance of Jerusalem, right away start in the old city of Jerusalem. While outside of the old city, bigger picture than that, a lot of people believe or think or see the Israeli settlement enterprise as an enterprise being run and pushed by national religious Messianic Jews who believe in the beginning of the redemption process, a third temple, Messiah, etc., etc. And indeed, we have those in our society, and very quick after the war, they start to put pressure and try to promote settlements. And probably in the first place they will succeed is, you can see here in blue, this is Kfar Etzion. Hanan Porat, who is a student in Merkaz Arav, a national religious yeshiva in Jerusalem, the hub of Jewish Messianic, national religious Jewish Messianic thought, a yeshiva headed by Arav Kook. He comes from a family from Kfar Etzion. Okay, in 1948, before 1948, we used to have 4 Jewish villages in what is today Gush Etzion. We lost them in the war in 48 to the Jordanian army. And he comes from there, I am a refugee, a Jewish refugee from there, organizes other family members from the families from before 48, and they put pressure on the government and want to return. And in September 67, the government says, okay, and Kfar Etzion is built. Another settlement that religious Messianic Jews will drive very quick will be Hebron. April 68, first Passover after the 6-day war is over. Again, yeshiva students from Merkaz Arav, the same national religious Messianic yeshiva, ask permission to celebrate Passover in Hebron. They get permission only for Passover. They rent a Palestinian hotel. Passover is over. They refuse to leave. And we have the settlement in Hebron. Interestingly enough, also in Hebron, yeah, the second settlement by the religious zealots, there is an element of Jews returning, yeah, because there's not only the tomb of the patriarchs, a sacred religious site, but also there was for centuries Jewish presence in Hebron, a Jewish community that was destroyed, and a massacre carried by Palestinians in August 1929. So Kfar Etzion and Hebron have this element of return. In 1968, we have another settlement by zealots, but this time it's not religious zealots. It's secular zealots who believe in the Messiah and third temple type stuff. I know it sounds weird, but we have them at the edge of the radical right in Israel. 7 families who come from the Lehi, the Stern Gang, one of the paramilitary terrorist organizations who were fighting the British occupation in the 40s. And they take over a building in the Palestinian village of Beit Hanina, which was annexed and becomes East Jerusalem. And that's how the third settlement by zealots in the first year and a half of the occupation began. But here is few things to understand. It is not only zealots, and it's definitely not the driving story here. For several reasons. First of all, because the idea of Greater Israel back then in 1967, after the euphoria, the feeling of the victory in 1967, defeating all the Arab countries around, this idea of Greater Israel is way more mainstream than that. The movement for Greater Israel that starts in 1967, part of the leaders come from the heart of the Labor Party, the labor movement. Natan Alterman, Chaim Guri, our national poets, etc. Another thing to keep in mind is that the green line is the armistice lines of 49. It's not the dream border necessarily of Israel. It's just where previous war ended. Plus, let's not forget that the idea that wherever Jews will reside and settle and work the land in the land of Israel, that will determine the boundaries of Israel. This is not a new concept post-1967. This is how the Zionist movement worked before 48. So it just makes sense that when given the opportunity, we might try to correct the borders and continue to ride that wave. And indeed, we've done it with 3 gigantic projects in the first year of the occupation led by the government. Nothing to do with the third temple coming and arriving around the corner, but everything to do with reshaping borders, national security, and etc. So the first 2 projects are around Jerusalem. We can see the green line. We can see the red line, the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. And you have another green line here, Mount Scopus, Hebrew University. That was an island on the Jordanian occupation. And we want to connect. So the government will launch what is called a bolt neighborhood project, like a bolt of a door. Basically, territorial contiguity coming in out from West Jerusalem into East Jerusalem to connect Mount Scopus. Okay? 4 settlements. Ramat Eshkol, Givat HaMivtar, Ma'alot Dafna, and the French Hill are all built from 68 to 72. The lands for these settlements are expropriated from their Palestinian owners already in January 68. So this is very quick after the war. This is already in action. And again, this is not crazy Messianic religious zealots. This is Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, Ramat Eshkol. Okay? That's after him. The second project that we will embark on around Jerusalem is the Ring Neighborhood Project. You see the dark blue? Basically, the idea is Jerusalem, our capital, is a border town. We want to move a bit, the border from middle of the town, and we want to control the mountain ridge. Okay, this is about the geography of the Holy Land, coming from the east, Jordan Valley, up to the mountain ridge, and down to the coastal plain. Okay, so we want to be on top, and we want to turn East and West Jerusalem to one urban fabric and disconnect Palestinian East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. So can you see the sandwich here? Israeli West Jerusalem, Palestinian East Jerusalem, Israeli East Jerusalem. The same here. Israeli West Jerusalem, Palestinian East Jerusalem, Israeli. The first settlement in the Ring Neighborhood Project we're going to build is Neve Yaakov in 1970. This is very common in the settlement project that you're going to see is you first mark the line where you want to reach, the end here, and then in the 80s, Pisgat Ze'ev will fill in the gap. The next will be Gilo, 71, 73, Talpiot East, 74, Ramot. And then later on, Al Choma and Ramat Shlomo, not part of the original project, but to serve the same strategic principle. Disconnecting Palestinian East Jerusalem from the West Bank. And the third project is the Alon Plan. Yigal Alon has an idea. We take the entire West Bank and divide it to 2 from north to south. The Western Strip, the mountain ridge, where most of the Palestinian urban centers are, you can see, the cities, Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, Tukarim, Kalkilia. We don't want demographics, remember? This is going to be the future Palestinian demography. While the Eastern Strip, the Jordan Valley, and the beginning of the slopes up to the mountain is going to be annexed to Israel and serve as a security belt, achieving 2 strategic goals. 1, disconnecting Palestinians from Jordanians so they cannot merge against us. 2, moving what was called our eastern frontier from the Green Line, where we face Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, moving from the Green Line to the Jordan River, and basically using the geography as a slowdown to prevent an invasion from the east. The Alon Plan has, by the way, also applied to Gaza, but we don't have the time to talk about it. The Alon Plan has another principle, which is around Jerusalem, to cement the connection between Jerusalem and the coastal plain, the rest of the country. You can see this triangle, like a belt around Jerusalem. Today, the settlements of Modi'in Elit, Givat Ze'ev in the north, and many more, Ma'ale Adumim in the east, and Gush Etzion in the south, if it rings a bell. Later on, as the Jordanian option, what was called, came onto the table, which was the idea of connecting, it's not Palestinians, these are Arabs, connecting the Arab autonomy here to Jordan. So Alon opened a corridor around Jericho with emphasizing it needs to be narrow enough. We should have military presence on both sides, monitor the demilitarization of the autonomy, and in case it's being violated, we can intervene and disconnect it again. So let's sum up the first year of the occupation. While the Zealots have built 3 settlements, the House of the Seven, Kfar Etzion, and Hebron, today about what, 2,500 settlers live there? The government embarked on 3 gigantic projects that have nothing to do with, the Third Temple and the Messiah arriving, but rather to do with fixing Israel's borders and making sure that the Jordan River will be our eastern border and no other sovereign entity will exist between the river to the sea. The Ring neighborhood, the Bolt neighborhood, and the Alon Plan, where 71% of settlers today live within those areas. Another 2 interesting things that the Alon Plan put on the table, things that are so common in what we face today when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One is the idea of demilitarizing the future Palestinian entity, already in Alon, remember? That's why the narrow corridor and military presence so we can intervene. And the second one is the idea of replacing territorial contiguity for Palestinians via transportation contiguity. Yeah, you see the road here connecting the north and south of the West Bank. For the ones of us who are following very closely developments on the ground, there's what is called the Eastern Ring, Jerusalem Eastern Ring Road. Some call it the Apartheid Road because it's a road going from the north to the south of the West Bank around Jerusalem, basically through an area called E1. We don't have the time to talk about what that is, with a wall in the middle. So one side Palestinians, one side Israelis. You can, in a way, the idea, again, not the exact drawing and, coordinates of it, but the idea of this corridor that connects north and south and not territorial contiguity is already in the first year of the occupation, very quick, July 13th, right after the war, a month. And in a way, developing the settlements within the boundaries of the Alon Plan is the policy of the government for the next few years until Yom Kippur War, October 73. Israel wins the war, but at a very high price. Over 2,200 soldiers are killed. And before the war, when Egypt offers land for peace, what is the famous answer by Dayan? I prefer to have Shalom Hashech in Sinai without peace than peace without Shalom Hashech. It is the price of Yom Kippur War that changes the minds of some within the Labour Party. And suddenly the party is split more seriously. And there is an element who supports land for peace. And it's then that the settler movement, Gush Emunim, the Block of Faithful, will emerge, January 30th, 1974. Before that, there was no need for an external pressure group. The government was building more settlements than you ever thought. The government wasn't planning to give land for peace. But the second there is this crack, we need the external pressure group, the settler movement. And what do they want at the beginning? They go to the Golan Heights. They go, different places. But in the West Bank, they look for, these are religious zealots, they look for religious sites. And the place they're going to try to settle around is Nablus. Because Jerusalem we have by then, Hebron we have. So now Nablus. And they're going to try once and twice and 3 and 4 and 5 times and it won't work. When the government doesn't want something really, it finds a way. By the way, 1982, Israel invaded South Lebanon. I don't know if you knew, but the settler movement actually started a settlement in South Lebanon. Doesn't exist today. When the government doesn't want really something, it doesn't happen. And that's sadly enough where some of the settlers got basically brains, strategy, and understood that bouncing their head against the wall, i.e. the entire government, won't work. What they need is, the government is polarized. Some part want this and the other part are not with them. Land for peace, yes or no, Alon Plan or Dayan, etc. And they find allies who want to break out of the lines of Alon And now we need to be strategic. This is not anymore just about religious sites. It's about the fragmentation of Palestinian space to prevent a future emergence of any Palestinian entity in these territories. And back then, you see these red dots here in the map. This is the highest mountain in the West Bank. You can see it here on top. The Ministry of Defense is building a radar system for the Israeli army. It's right above the main highway between Jericho and Ramallah. There's a piece of land there on the highway that the Jordanian army started expropriation of it to build a Jordanian camp. Settlers make a deal with Shimon Peres, more or less, the Minister of Defense. Yeah, he will become their patron back then. We are employees. We work to build a military base. Every day we commute back to Jerusalem at the end of the day. But one day, instead of commuting to Jerusalem, Independence Day 75, they take over the Jordanian camp and start Ofra. And here you can see the settlement of Ofra today. Until today, there was no master plan for this settlement, no building permits, because the cabinet never approved it back then. Now, this government actually is fast-tracking retroactively a master plan. But this is, in a way, the so-called first outpost, yeah? With the help of the Minister of Defense, behind the back of the government, the first success of the settler movement. That's going to be their modus operandi. In the next few years, Dumim, another success based on an old camp, yeah? And by May 1977, when the first elections in Israel, that the Likud takes power, Begin becomes prime minister. This is the map of the West Bank. And you can see that apart from 3 settlements here, all the other settlements are within the lines of the Alon Plan. And yes, it's not too many, but don't forget, by then, there was already 19 settlements in the Golan Heights. There was about 20 settlements in Sinai and Gaza. The Labor Party at the time is spread thin. Begin will evacuate Sinai in a few years, and then we'll focus on the West Bank and Gaza. Likud takes power in Arik Sharon, Minister of Agriculture, but chair of the ministerial cabinet for settlements. There are 2 different maps that you can find of the Sharon plan. I haven't confirmed yet exactly what is fully accurate, so I'm putting both here, but they both follow the same principles. Sharon is a big fan of the eastern strip of Alon, and he will support and reinforce it. A big fan of this triangle around Jerusalem. But Sharon will add 2 more things. One is another western strip, just to erase the green line, yeah? And make sure that this can never serve as a future border. And Sharon will take the idea of internal fragmentation to the masterpiece of today. Palestinian development in the West Bank is north to south, and he will build settlements along the north-south roads, but he will also introduce east-west corridors. You see them? Later on, those ideas will be put into a plan, a master plan down to details by Matityahu Drobles, the main planner of the settlement division of the World Zionist Organization, Drobles Plan, and there it is, you can see, yeah, the complete fragmentation, yeah, based on the north-south roads and introducing the east-west. And every Palestinian city will be encircled apart from Jenin. Okay, the yellow are planned, and we didn't complete the encirclement of Jenin. But apart from that, every Palestinian city is encircled. And these are quotes, yeah, from the Drobles Plan, okay, to settle the land between the Arab minority population centers and their surrounding in order to minimize the danger of the development of an additional Arab state. Will be cut off by Jewish settlements. It will be hard for the minority population to create territorial contiguity and political unity. By the way, Palestinians are the majority in the West Bank, but they're the minority inside the green line, so we're using the same phrases. So by now, we understand, yeah, that apart from the first 3 settlements driven by the Zealots, every settlement we have in the West Bank is here to make sure one thing will never happen, which is a Palestinian state. That Israel will remain the one sovereign power, river to the sea. As we arrive to 87, the first Intifada, look at the map then, okay? The light blue are the settlements from the Labor Party line, okay, as we said, mainly on the Alon lines, okay, only 3 outside, and the dark blue are the ones of Sharon. So you can really see where Sharon works. He is reinforcing, yeah, 4 settlements here, 2 here, 3, 4, yeah, he's reinforcing the eastern strip of Alon. A lot of development around Jerusalem, the western strip, the internal fragmentation on north-south, and the east-west corridors, yeah? Okay, the encirclement. We get to Oslo. Okay, I'm skipping things because I want to leave time for a conversation, and we can't really cover everything in one talk. We arrive at Oslo. Let me say something here. Up front, publicly, Rabin, by then is against the Palestinian state. At best, an autonomy plus, a state minus. While for Palestinians, Oslo was a way to a Palestinian state, yeah, for Israel, it wasn't. At the beginning, at least the intention. But I believe that if Rabin wouldn't have been assassin, we might have ended there. Because I see Rabin as a revolutionary person in the history of Israel. We don't have time to go too much into this, but I just say, I think, first and foremost, because this very basic idea we take for granted today, which citizenship is territorial and every human being within a given territory is a citizen of that country and is equal, is so foreign for our DNA, and the nation state law just proves it from the last few years. Rabin was the only prime minister we had that counted Palestinian Israelis' votes and voice as fully legitimate Israelis. And I think that played a big part in why he was assassinated. We don't have the time to go into this. So I'm not one of those who believe that Oslo was a conspiracy from day one to advance and, control. It definitely ended up there. And we're going to talk now why, yeah? Like major issues, major flaws. But I don't think that was the intention of Rabin. I know that some people might disagree with me, but I'm willing to defend my argument, but not today. So Oslo B95, an interim agreement, 5 years, right? You need to reach a final status agreement at the end of the day. We don't jump from 0 to 100, so we start this breakdown. Area A, 18%, full management of the Palestinian authorities, mainly the urban centers. Area B, the suburbs, kind of like the villages, Israeli security control, and civilian management by the Palestinian Authority. Area C, settlements, roads connecting them, open areas, 60%. Complete control of Israel. By the way, under Oslo, the IDF is the sovereign power, basically the ultimate power all over A, B, C. Okay, it doesn't matter. Number one problem in Oslo, I think the biggest mistake Rabin did was a strategy that I don't change the geography until the final status agreement. So ABC are designed according to the grid, the geographic grid of the existing settlements. And what they intended to do, remember? To fragment, to make sure that there is no territorial contiguity and political unity. So once Area C is based on the settlement design, and Oslo is not anymore temporary for 5 years, but permanent for 25 years like today, ends up a more advanced mechanism of control and fragmentation. The second thing in Oslo is, if you think that the strategic ideas of the Eastern Strip, Western Strip, the Jerusalem Triangle belt that we were talking about, we've abandoned in Oslo, you're completely wrong. Look at it. The map shows very clear. Palestinian villages in the Eastern Strip barely get area B and C around them. Yeah, they're very skinny. Palestinian villages in the Jerusalem Triangle, Jerusalem belt, also very limited. Western Strip, also very limited. It is only between where Palestinians get the majority of territory B, yeah? Because these strategic ideas are still driving our maps. The third issue in Oslo that I'd like to say, and in my eyes, the cancer that killed Oslo. In order to allow Israelis to drive through the West Bank without leaving direct supervisions of the IDF, i.e. without going through Area A, bypass roads were built around Area A. So if old Road 60, which is the main north-south road in West Bank, used to go through Ramallah, there is a new Road 60 that was built bypassing Ramallah. Every time we get to a Palestinian city, we split. The old road continues through the city, the new road around. If the old Road 60 went through Bethlehem, the new road bypasses. And why I said this is the cancer that killed Oslo. How many settlers were in the West Bank outside of East Jerusalem in 95? 116,000. How many today? 440,000. So it's during the days of the so-called peace process that the number of settlers more than tripled. And one of the main reasons is the bypass roads. And I'm going to explain why. Until today, the settlements are not an economic viable project. More than 60% of settlers commute daily to work in Israel. So if I'm a settler, in Ofra, okay, I need to drive on Road 60 to Jerusalem to work. And that means I drive through Ramallah. This is the 80s, late 80s, the first Intifada. The average Israeli Jew driving through Ramallah doesn't feel at home. Traffic in the city, bad infrastructure, old roads, etc. And don't forget, security-wise, this is the days of the first Intifada, driving through El Amari refugee camp, Kalandia refugee camp, not safe. Don't worry. A modern highway outside of the city, you don't see much Palestinians, you feel at home, and you're more safe and easier to commute. The same with if I'm a settler from Efrat and Gush Etzion and I commute to Jerusalem. Not anymore through Bethlehem where I don't feel at home, near Aida refugee camp, the Aisha refugee camp. No, a modern highway. So it is the bypass roads that are the main driving force to suburbanize the settlers. My two sisters and brother who live today in settlements in the West Bank, by the way, right here, would have never gone there if you didn't have that infrastructure that separates you from the Palestinians. And don't think it's a coincidence. The planners knew it, from day two, more or less. It's already from the 80s. That's how it works. Look, this is a quote from a government project plan from 97, okay? Post-Oslo, this is after Oslo, okay? We are heading towards a new reality. What are we going to do? I'm skipping a little bit, but is it a shared road or parallel roads? The first option, which is parallel roads, provides a better solution for the issue of segregation and even in tense times allows for togetherness that maintains separation. The second option is cheaper and better for traffic, but only suitable for peacetime. Planners understood, okay, that the segregation in the West Bank is the oxygen for the development of the settlement enterprise. Post-Oslo, we are fighting over Area C, and I'm going to do this very quick in order to leave time for a conversation. We have the outpost phenomenon by today, about 130 plus outposts. You can see on the grid of fragmentation reinforcing Israeli contiguity and Palestinian fragmentation. You can see doubling the municipal boundaries of settlements from 5.1% to over 9%, almost doubling, and a new strategic plan by the settlement unit in 97, post-Oslo. And you can see, 5 super zones of settlements, in the east-west corridors of Sharon. Jordan Valley, okay, as a barrier between Palestinian population centers and Jordan, because we have peace treaty with Jordan, by the way, by then, okay? Our eastern frontier has moved from the Jordan River further to the border of Jordan, but we still want this. You can see northern Samaria dividing Palestinians from Jenin Yabed to Palestinian citizens of Israel in the north. These are all quotes from the government project plan. South Hebron Hills, okay, between Bedouins in the Negev, Palestinians and Bedouins in the south. and just cheap housing to expand the coastal plain. And you can see the strategic corridors east-west of Sharon. We haven't given up. Second Intifada will come. The separation barrier is planned. And believe it or not, at the beginning, there was an eastern barrier for the Eastern Strait. We haven't given up the idea. You see the Netanyahu annexation plan? We haven't given up the ideas, okay? But, and the last two things, and then I'll wrap it up. But actually today, security-wise, the eastern frontier of Israel is not anymore the Jordan River. We have a peace treaty with Jordan. And part of the peace treaty, Jordan is not allowed to allow basically enemy troops going through its territory, yeah, to attack us. So we actually have hundreds of kilometers corridor here, okay, of strategic depth to prevent the eastern frontier. But we are still talking about as if we are in 67, even though the entire security reality around us has changed. We know what happened to the Syrian army and the civil war. We know what happened to the Iraqi army in the last decades. Yeah, but still we are talking as if nothing has changed, holding on to concepts that completely expired. So after saying that, the security differences is a big problem. I know that up to now it all sounded out, everything comes together perfectly, but there is a major problem, and that is we don't have settlers. This is not China and Tibet. We don't have 4 or 5 million Israeli Jews to move and change the identity of the land, okay? And that's why we brought in the Ultra-Orthodox. Cheap housing, but that's also more than 50% of growth in settlers from Oslo to today are Ultra-Orthodox, okay? This is a community that is not invested ideologically in it, but comes for cheap housing. They are today 40% of the entire settler population, even though they joined only in the 1990s. But another great weakness is, you see Modi'in Illit and Beitar Illit, two cities of Ultra-Orthodox, hold together 20% of the entire settler population, but are what, 3-4 kilometers from the Green Line, leave no impact on the geography, which is not good for the settlement enterprise. Yeah, you can see, yeah, get a bit of an idea of Modi'in Illit and Beitar Illit. What's the demography today? In the West Bank, we've jumped from 0 Israeli Jews to 640, but from 700,000 to 3 million. And even greater, look what happens demographically between the river to the sea. Yeah, this is a great weakness. We moved from 65% to 35% to 50-50. In a way, to sum it up and to move for Q&A, and sorry for taking more time than I planned, is at the end of the day, what we see is that the ruthless geographic policies of Israel, yeah, are here to cover the inherent weakness of demography. And ultimately, it's not working to actually assert demographic dominance. And that's why you need to be so ruthless, yeah? Because that's where your strength comes. It's not from the demography. Summing it all up, what we've seen very clearly is that from 1967 to today, yes, there was a debate. There were different schools of thoughts in the Israeli government. Some part wanted only the Alon lines. Some wanted to break out. Some want a formal sovereignty. Some want only control. Yeah. But what we can see is a consistent move to implement what I would call the national project of Israel in the last 53 years, which is to maintain military dominance over the Palestinian people in the occupied territories. And that vector has never changed. Again, even though the security issues have changed, and even though we have a significant demographic weakness. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much, and I hope it made sense and wasn't too fast and wasn't too much.
Thank you so much, Yehuda. We have quite a few questions that have come in throughout your presentation. So I'm going to get started by merging a few of them to begin with. So the IDF and settlements are so embedded in the West Bank. Is it still possible for Israel to withdraw? And is a two-state solution with a contiguous Palestinian state still possible?
I was planning to argue more this in the next session to actually show kind of like a bulletproof position. My answer is yes. I call myself, a two-state extremist, so to speak, in a way, for different reasons. But first and foremost, I would argue this idea that we haven't brought Israel to loosen its grip over the occupied territories. And as we saw, it is the vector of all Israeli governments. The occupation is the Israeli project. We're going to bring Israel to dissolve itself and turn a democracy river to the sea. Doesn't make sense to me. Secondly, it is the demographic separation that matches two states. Meaning, if Nablus would have moved to Tel Aviv, if 200,000 Palestinians from Hebron would have moved into the Green Line, and another 300,000 Israelis would have moved to the Jordan Valley, then I would say, nah. Demography suits a geographic resolution of one state. But we are still, and again, we will see it better in the next session when we talk about access and movement and what it means and how we kept that structure. But we are still, demographically, we are more closer to a geography of two states. Now, of course, Israel doesn't want two states, and that's why we haven't gotten there. Israel does everything to create facts on the ground to prevent us from getting there, building more and more settlements, doing them even in more strategic locations, etc., improving the project. But I don't think we're there. But every day that goes by, we will need more and more to generate more and more political force to reverse it. And that is our nightmare.
All right, thank you. Stuart on Zoom asks, even if de jure annexation is stopped, what can be done about rolling back to the de facto annexation?
I want to say something about before what can be done. I would say, look, some parts within the Israeli political class and within Israeli public have been calling for annexation from day one. Remember? The movement for Greater Israel, 67, etc., settler movement, 74. But relatively, they're a minority in our society. The main reasons why they're so powerful today are two. One is the Trump administration, okay? It is David Friedman and the gang who are coming in saying to Israel, hey, what are you doing still only controlling Palestinians? Come and annex. We're going to back you. And Netanyahu legal's problems of, he needs to make sure that he doesn't go to prison. These two things basically take us to where we are, to the crisis that we are today. 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, no one could even, from the annexation camp in Israel, no one could fantasize on having all the stars aligned on their side now. The Trump administration in power going madly on this and being very ideological on Israel-Palestine. Yeah, we've seen all the steps. The embassy, Golan, just continue the list, you know better than me. Plus, Europe, busy with internal issues, Brexit, refugees, Corona, and Orban, because foreign policy in Europe is unanimity. You have Hungary, you have the rising of the illiberal democracy, the best friends of Netanyahu who block everything. Okay? Plus India, Brazil, these powers with non-liberal democracies. You have a majority in Israeli Knesset for annexation. If we stop annexation now, this is not going back to where we were a year ago. This will be a huge blow to the idea of annexation. Because if annexation cannot be fulfilled now when all the stars are aligned, it might be a fantasy that cannot be fulfilled for the next 50 years. So if annexation is stopped, this is way more than just stopping annexation.
Well, that's somewhat uplifting then. Peter Fry asks, what would you say that ultimate annexation was, in a way, always the plan of the Israeli government?
I don't believe that annexation of full territory was a plan of the Israeli government all along. As I said, there were forces who were talking about this. Formal, de jure annexation was not the plan. Looking at the evidence, again, there were people who wanted it, but there were people who didn't want, exactly because they didn't want to swallow the demography. So they were struggling with how to have the control over the entire territory. As we saw, all the strategy was put into cementing that and looking for ways not to swallow, saying that this is temporary, talking about an autonomy, different ways and different. By the way, interestingly enough, it is Gaza that Israel wanted to annex all of these years, up to the 1990s. Yeah? I know that the common belief around here is that, oh no, it's the biblical land in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. Gaza is not important. Actually, Gaza was more important from a strategic point of view of a front versus, in front of Egypt, etc. And even Alon and his plans had the idea of resettling the refugees from the Gaza Strip in the West Bank, annexing Gaza, and give full citizenship to the original residents of the Gaza Strip, which are a tiny minority, okay, relatively. So something that will not harm the demographic issue. So until the 1990s, annexation was more relevant to Gaza than to the West Bank.
Okay, thank you. Abraham on Zoom asks, given the chronic instability and authoritarian political condition of the Arab world, why shouldn't Israel maintain full military control west of the Jordan River? And I'd like to add as well a second question here. What are the security implications for the IDF and Israel if Israel maintains control over all of Area C and the entrance and exit points to areas A and B?
So look, I think one needs to look at it in two ways. There is the value-based perspective on this, and there is the interest-based perspective on this. To be honest, I'm more interested in values, yeah? But I'm willing to also talk about interests, okay? But a value-based perspective for me is the idea, yeah, that we have a right to strip millions of people from rights forever, yeah? Because we think that this is necessary for our security. Unacceptable for me. This is not democracy. This is not what Israel is supposed to be. Yeah? Occupation is supposed to be a temporary reality. Hence, you're allowed to suspend rights of people because it's temporary. And ultimately, they need to get it back. Yeah? The second thing is, this argument in my eyes is the most anti-Zionist argument I can think of. Because Zionism, the way I understand it, comes from the perspective, from the idea, the argument that nations have a right to self-determination. We Jews say we are being fed with being ruled by others and we want independence. But the same idea applies also to Palestinians. This idea that the only way I will be allowed to exercise my right to self-determination is if I strip the exact same right from my Palestinian neighbor, completely unacceptable.
Fantastic.
Now let's move to the interest base for a minute. And I would say the thinking that we forever are going to control and oppress a growing demographics and trying to squeeze them into shrinking geography, and that will be sustainable and will achieve a stability is insane. Never worked before in history. Ain't reason to believe it's going to work today. And it's going to take Israel morally down to a very bad path.
Thank you. So I want to add a quick note. We're going to go a little over time, although I know some of you may have to log off at 3 Eastern. We're going to stick around until about 3:15. Stay tuned if you have questions. If you have to log off, just know that the recording of this conversation will be available later today at jstreet.org/j-stream. So you can find the rest of it if you do need to go a little early. Now, William Berger on Zoom asks, Yehuda, do you believe that the threat of annexation will force, in quotation marks, the PA to reconsider its refusal to negotiate with Israel in order to salvage something in the West Bank?
I think this is definitely what the Trump administration wants, in a way. Not even threat, to implement. Yeah? They are joining Netanyahu in the goal of trying to achieve Palestinian surrender. And I just don't believe it's possible. Yeah? Palestinians are just like us and just like you in the US. No human being will agree to live under the regime we are putting Palestinians under, where you have no basic rights, nor civil political rights, nor human rights. Yeah? Where at any moment, a whole list of things that are unthinkable for you in the US can happen to you, and they're all legally under the military law. We in the military can break into your house in the middle of the night, yeah, tear apart the place. We don't need a warrant. We don't need probable cause. We don't need all these things that you are used to from a democracy, irrelevant. Yeah, we do that for many different reasons. Sometimes with intelligence, most without. For what we call in the military, making our presence felt. Yeah, this is one of the things I used to do a lot as a soldier. The idea goes this way. If Palestinians will get the feeling that the IDF is all the time everywhere, they'll be afraid to attack. So what do you do to make them feel this way? You make your presence felt. In different parts of the West Bank, it will manifest itself in different ways. In Hebron, where I served for over a year, which is an urban setting, you have 850 settlers in the midst of 230,000 Palestinians. You have 3 patrols, but that's their mission statement, to make their presence felt 24/7. Start your night patrol 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning. Walk in the streets of the old city, of the Kasbah, bump into a house. It's a random house. It's not a house we have intelligence. Don't get me wrong. It's a random house. The sergeant, the officer who leads the patrol, chooses the house, bumps into the house, wakes up the family, searches the place. You can imagine what happens when the military unit enters your house 2 o'clock in the morning. Finish searching, go out to the street, knock on some doors, make some noise, run to the other corner of the street, invade another house. And that's how you spend an 8-hour shift. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from September 2000, when the second Intifada started, till today. It didn't stop for 1 second. The idea is very simple. Every Palestinian needs to feel the military is right here. We're breathing down your neck. It's to do what we call in the military, yeah, the military phrase, the mission statement is ליצור תחושת נרדפות אצל האוכלוסייה הפלסטינית, to create the sense of being chased, of being pursued inside the Palestinian population. That is the meaning of ruling another people against their will permanently. You need to make them fear you, and once they get used to a level of fear, you have to increase it, and it's a whole without a bottom. To agree to live your entire life like this? No. And by the way, I really hope the Palestinian Authority will not do that. Because if they will do that, they will legitimize the Trump plan that not only greenlights annexation, but also breaks the entire paradigm of 2 states, Security Council resolutions, of international law, etc., which I think is extremely problematic. Yeah? And it's really a kind of germs you don't want to open. That's a road you don't want to walk down. Yeah? It's how to put it? Yes, the Trump plan talks about negotiating a Palestinian state. They're using all the right words, yeah? But this is Orwell at its best. War is peace, yeah? Bantustans are a state. And that is a very, very problematic and negative way to go.
Thank you, Yehuda. Ari on Zoom asks, how prevalent are Alon and Diane's ideas in Israeli politics today? How do you see them
Madeleine, I couldn't hear you at the beginning.
Oh, sorry. Ari on Zoom asks, how prevalent are Alon and Diane's ideas in Israeli politics today? How do you see them manifesting in mainstream contemporary Israeli politics?
Now, mainly Alon, yeah, not Diane, yeah? The idea of the Jordan Valley, yeah? Again, even though, as I said, security-wise, the world has changed, yeah? We have a peace treaty with Jordan. We have a peace treaty with Egypt. Yeah, like serious security experts will tell you that, yeah, the threat is not a massive amount of tanks coming from Saudi and Iraq through Jordan into our eastern frontier. Yeah, that's not the story anymore. Still, that is very much enshrined in Israeli politics, and it's not for no reason that you have Benny Gantz, not agreeing to attack Netanyahu's pledge for annexation of Jordan Valley before the elections, if not even joining him then, and joining him now in government with a platform of annexation.
Got it. We have another question from Zachary on Zoom. Was most of the settlement land taken directly from private Palestinian owners, or do we just assume the West Bank is land that collectively belongs to the Palestinians?
I would say it's more closer to number one. Yeah, it's the amount of land grab that Israel has done from 1967 to today in the West Bank is enormous. And also in East Jerusalem, by the way. More than 1/3, a little bit more than 1/3 of the land that was annexed in East Jerusalem was expropriated. And much of it was allocated to settlements. In the West Bank, around 18% of private Palestinian land in different levels of private, because there is an issue of lands in the West Bank and we don't have the time to go into it because not all the lands were registered and organized. Because in the Ottoman Empire time, those things didn't happen, and then the British started it, and Jordanians continued a little bit, but then Israel came in the middle, and 1967. So we're not going to go into, if you want, we can do a whole day on land, and I think it's important actually. But about 18% of the land in the West Bank was taken from private Palestinians, and another a little bit more than that is what was called public land under British and Jordanian control that basically was taken by the IDF, and parts of it were allocated to settlements and to other things, So enormous amount of land grab and theft. And by the way, annexation will basically one of the main consequences of annexation that could happen is a huge increase in land grab.
Fantastic. Robert on Zoom asks, what should we make of Abbas's announcement that the PA will no longer comply with Oslo?
Wow. Every questionnaire is spot on. Look, the truth is that I'm not an expert for Palestinian society and politics. So unfortunately, I don't think I can give an opinion from, an insider opinion on this. This is not the first time that we heard these threats from Abbas and from the PA in different ways, versions, levels. What is obvious is that ultimately, continuing security cooperation with Israeli forces, continuing legitimacy to the PA by its people, any shred of legitimacy, there's not much left, but the remaining, after annexation, if security cooperation continues, will be dramatic to the PA internally. And without security coordination, I doubt Israel is going to allow an entity like this to continue to exist in Area A. Armed policemen, etc. Nah. It can be a game changer if implemented, but whether he's actually going to do it or not, above my pay grade. And I'm not a prophet also.
So we have a few more questions about Israeli politics and annexation, so I'm going to ask them together. Stuart on Zoom asks, exactly how does Netanyahu's push for annexation keep him out of jail? Will the annexationists in Knesset grant him immunity? Marcia on Zoom asks, who do you see as the best leader in Israel to push against annexation? And I would like to also ask if there's any hope that Israeli public opinion will turn against annexation in any significant way. Yehuda, I think you're muted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sorry. When it comes to the first question, how does the annexation keep Netanyahu? The idea is kind of like a deal between him and the religious right. Yeah, to have a majority in parliament, give him immunity in some form or way. Yeah, because he pays back with annexation. Yeah, that is kind of like the traditional point of view. Whether that exactly is going to be the mechanism, who knows? But that's the idea. There. The about Israeli political leadership against annexation, about public opinion in Israel. Look, as I said, annexation is not something that has the support of the majority of Israelis. Still, we are far away from a reality where a majority of Israeli Jews will march in the streets against it. And just like we didn't march up to now against occupation, I believe and I fear that we're not going to march against annexation. We, the anti-annexation and the anti-occupation camp in Israel, are going to put the fight of our life. We are a minority. Yeah? We will not win without help from outside. And I think for you in J Street and for the people, the audience who are listening to us, without your help, we're not going to win this battle. More than anything, we need that help in order to change the cost-benefit calculation of the leadership in Israel. Now, think of it. As I said earlier, the Trump administration is a huge part of why annexation is on the table now. And I think that should teach us something, progressives in the States and progressives in Israel. And that is, the annexationists in Israel they don't have the political power to implement their plan. It is the fact that when their allies got the White House, they are ideologues and are implementing their ideology that suddenly makes the unbelievable to the possible. Yeah? And I think that should say something to future Democratic administrations in the state, to progressive American Jewry, to progressive Americans, to progressive Europeans. What we need to make sure is that we don't repeat the same mistake of years where our allies ideologically, the progressives in the US were in power, still allowed policies of occupation and settlements to continue. What we need from the next Democratic administration in the US is a clear, forceful intervention, to change those policies. The strength of the annexationists in Israel came from their allies willing to live their ideology when they got power. We will be, our force in Israel will multiply if our allies abroad, when given power, will actually have the spine to live up to our values and ideology.
Thank you. To continue on that thread, Yehuda, if Netanyahu implements de jure annexation now, and if Biden is elected in November, do you think a Democratic U.S. administration could help reverse annexation? You said the U.S. needs a clear message. What does that look like?
Look, the truth is that if the U.S. really wants, it can force Israel to do almost anything. I think that is a question for you in the US, because you know better than me how much of political capital and maneuver in space, there is for a future Democratic administration to reverse annexation. My instinct is, I fear that there is not enough. Far from that. That's why Democrats need to put the foot already now. I fear that undoing this, demands way more political capital than putting the foot now and preventing it from happening. And I think that should be the way to go with it. And we see it with the embassy and what Biden said about it, and we see it with other things, Yeah.
Okay, so we're starting to get to the last 2 or 3 questions. I have a question from Stuart. What does breaking the silence need to amplify its message to the Israeli public?
What does breaking the silence need? Many things. It's not, we're not going to do now a session from human resources, financial resources, networks and connections, and, et cetera, and being able to go to the field and not being stuck on webinars, et cetera. No, but look, I go back to what I said earlier. I'm really serious with this. The Israeli anti-occupation camp, we are going to give whatever we can into this fight. And I want to be very, very clear here. By the way, I don't see myself as someone who is fighting in solidarity with Palestinians. I don't see myself as someone who's fighting the Palestinian fight for liberation. I see myself who is fighting the Israeli fight. Yeah, for a home that I want. Yeah, for my home to be the way I believe it should be. For an Israel, the way it was supposed to be, in my eyes. So I'm going to put everything for this. Yeah, this is my home. But the idea that Israeli Jews will, again, march into the streets with our majority, as a majority, against occupation, not only against annexation, against occupation, is completely flawed. People with privileges don't just give up their privileges. You didn't have a majority of whites in Alabama in 1950 against segregation. You didn't have a majority of whites in South Africa in 1972 or 75 against the apartheid regime there. You ain't going to have, a majority of Israeli Jews marching in the streets, shaking this place. What we will need to do is to build as significant as possible a minority of Israeli Jews in Israel who oppose occupation on a value-based principle. We will have to link to Palestinian citizens of Israel. Yeah, this is a huge electorate that we shouldn't separate ourselves from. That's where our big numbers also come. Yeah, not having an anti-occupation camp that is linked Jews and Palestinians in Israel. It's like trying to have a civil rights movement in the 60s and the 50s without African Americans. It's just nonsense. And then we will still be a minority. Then we will need our allies in the US and Europe. Then we will need Palestinians to become players in the right way. Yeah. And basically, we can change and flip things. Rabin came into power in 92. It is other things around that were also very important. Madrid, due to geopolitical issues, the first Gulf War, the first Intifada, many different things that came together. What we can do is build a foundation, ask from our allies to build their foundations, and basically put as much pressure, grow, develop, and wait for the opportunities, just like the annexationists are doing now with the opportunity they got with the Trump administration and Friedman.
Thank you, Yehuda. Now, some folks in the Q&A are asking if they can get this presentation. So if you are looking for it, you can go again to jstreet.org/j-stream to see this full recording after the live presentation ends. Now, Yehuda, can you give us a sneak peek of what you'll be covering in the next presentation?
So basically what we focused today was on the settlement enterprise itself, the master plans, the strategy behind placing settlements where and how. What we're going to touch them next time will be basically this overview of the development of Israel's policies about access and movement and restrictions of movement on Palestinians, Gaza, West Bank, Israel from 67 to today. And we're going to try to take what we saw today plus that, come to political conclusions, and try to understand how that links up to Israeli big strategy and annexation that we are facing today.
Fantastic. And as a reminder, that session will be next Wednesday, May 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern. You can register for it at jstreet.org/j-stream. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yehuda. I'm looking forward to the conversation next week. For folks who are listening, and please join our movement to stop annexation. You can learn more and see how you can take action at jstreet.org/stop annexation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really a privilege, and do what you can to change this. Thanks.
Take care, Yehuda.
Thank you.